Everyone hear me? Nothing like right after lunch. Did everyone have good lunch? Maybe we should do some calisthenics or something. I've just been informed that I butcher every name of an Australian city, so I will not use any Australian jokes or Minnesota jokes. I can just get into this stuff. So as you said, my name is Ben Schein. As you heard this morning, if you were at the keynotes, I now work for Domo. Spent about 10 years at Target Corporation US, which is not related to the Target stores here in Australia. And really a lot of my work at Domo now is trying to figure out how do we unlock data in a new way for the rest of the organization, beyond data scientists, beyond analysts, beyond all of that. And so part of what I want to talk about today, and I think we have time for questions at the end. I really don't mind if you shout out questions in the middle either. I think, if I had my druthers, we'd be around a big table and we could conversate and write notes and all that stuff. So feel free to shout if you have to, but there'll be time for questions at the end. And so what I wanted to do was spend a little bit of time unpacking, and obviously it's a big question, right? Like, how do you get people to use data? You can look at it a lot of different ways, but really unpacking some of what I saw at Target and some of what I think the secret sauce we had at Target to getting more people using data, getting more people using Domo, and looking at that. And when I think back about it, and I talked this morning about how data is emotional. It's very emotional, and it's easy for us to forget that. And when I think about the core dilemma that faces us as BI or analytics or data practitioners, this is what I sort of kept on coming back to, was it always seemed too hard to get the information I needed to solve a business problem, right? We heard that throughout the speakers this morning. Really, we're trying to solve a problem. But this is a very emotional thing, and this is what I felt it as someone who was delivering BI. Business users felt it as someone who was trying to get the data they need. And it's not necessarily rational, right? There's lots of reasons why data is not available, but that's, I think, the core dilemma that we face as an industry, as the practitioners of data, is that it just feels too hard, and we don't know why. And so I want to unpack a little bit about how we can tackle that. And so this might be hard to read on the big screens, but I'll go through some of the key points. But so this is a made-up version of a real email I got around 2016. And you can see it's from a buyer, right? It's in charge of assortment. And this is a buyer who's in charge of the storage and organization area at Target, right? So the big bins that you put stuff in. And this is an email that I got just after Black Friday, Thanksgiving, right? So we had all this effort as an organization to create reporting for the biggest, most important thing for our organization. And then she saw that reporting and she was like, hey, I also have an important time of the year. I also have a big time for my business, which actually is the week after Christmas, right? Because everyone gets all their gifts in the wrapping paper and whatnot, and then they need some place to store it. And so at least in the States for this business, that's the big thing. And I got this, and again, it stayed in my mind to the point that I could rewrite some of it as a fake email, and it really started to click this emotional side of data for me. Because I read it and I sort of saw her own emotional journey with data coming through. And so if you look at some of the words she uses, I know it's still small, even if it had to be scaled back, calling on my VP and the dollars and all these different things. And so there's all these emotions underlying how she sort of sent the email, even if she didn't even think about it. She just thought she was doing the right thing, right? So there's fear that what she's doing isn't as important as everything else. I know Black Friday was a big deal, but my stuff, it's not such a big deal. Or I'm willing to settle for less. It's important to me, but give me half of it, or give it to me on a day lag instead of real time, or whatever it is. This need to develop a business case, and that can be counterintuitive. Everyone says, well, no, of course you want to develop a business case. Why wouldn't you? And I was actually glad that she had put in some numbers and said this is how much this opportunity could be worth, but ultimately not everything needs a business case, right? That idea that she needed to my VP will tell you it's okay, right? Like I'm not enough as a buyer owning a small part of the business. I need executive sponsorship. And then just this sense that I'm just glad to have my request heard. And these aren't great emotions, right? I just felt like underlying the email, even though it was a very nice email, were all this emotional baggage that she had, and that we needed to unpack and be cognizant of as we changed the way that she engaged with data. And so, as I thought about why she was at this place and what things looked like, at least at Target, and I think at a lot of big organizations, I thought back a few years to 2013, where I was a slightly lower level middle manager at a big company, right? And I got thrown for various reasons to our capital committee. I had to go represent our team to get a few $1 million, I think it was, specifically for digital promotional data. And this is where my emotions came in, because that didn't feel right. It didn't feel like it should cost me $2 million to get some basic data. It didn't feel like that was maybe the best use of Target's money, especially if I knew the data might come and it might not work or it might not be correct or all those other things. And but there I was, talking to the CEO and the CFO and the chief merchant and all these people asking for this money. Didn't feel good for me, and I think that's the kind of thing, right? If I'm asking for $2 million for one slice of data, then of course I need executive approval and I need this business case and I need all these things. And so how did I go from that place where I needed $2 million to get data that probably would never work to a place where in 2016 when I got that email, I could say, you know what? No, we can give this to you in Domo because the data that you saw over Thanksgiving is already at an order item transaction level. And it's just going to take my team a couple hours to filter it the way you want it or to work with you to do that. And 2 hours of one analyst's time does not a business case need, right? Like it just should be part of how we use information. And so when I think about it, I think part of the difference between these 2 years and these two outcomes and these two sets of emotions is this idea of going from what I call end-to-end development, which we'll unpack a little bit, to more of this approach of end to almost end. And Domo fits into that, but as I said this morning, it's more than just tools and platforms. It's about how you approach your thinking of how you're empowering people. I guess the one other thing I would call out with this end to almost end is there's the emotion of the person asking for the data. There's also the emotion of my team helping, right? My team feels awesome if they can, in a couple hours, help someone and make them feel special and help them use data in a new and different way. Whereas I did not feel awesome asking for $2 million that I didn't think really cost $2 million. So what do I mean when I say end to end? And again, I'm making a lot of generalizations and obviously not everything worked this way at Target, not everything works this way. But in my mind, I think this is a lot of how we would approach things. So we'd say, hey, we have all these problems. And we'd say, you know what would be great? We should prioritize them. Who's going to argue with prioritizing? Prioritization is a great thing, right? And so we'd say, okay, we're picking this one. This is the one. This is the most important problem. Everyone has agreed, all the VPs, all the business cases, all these other things. And we'd say, okay, we're going to give them to a bunch of engineers or data scientists or analysts, or you can fill in the blank. And it's going to take a long time and maybe a lot of money too, right, by inference. So whether that's 6 months or 9 months or a year, we're going to sort of wait for that information to come. And so we wait and we wait, and hopefully, maybe, I'm not sure, and this is where I didn't have a lot of faith, even though I was asking for $2 million, that it really would come to this. That problem is solved, or at least we think it's solved, right? And we feel good, right? It is, we picked the most important thing, the engineers are close to the business, we're solving a problem, it all makes some logical sense, and you can see why people were making good decisions and sometimes the right decision. But my problem with it, and as I said before, is so now we've waited 9 months, and some problems sort of floated away, right? They weren't real problems, or I was wrong. Hopefully, the problems that floated away aren't the one I picked, right? Because if 9 months later it's no longer a problem, I just wasted all this time and money on this. But we did say no to all these other things, right? And so there's still need and business and value out there that we sort of rejected. And of course, as we all know in business, there's another 9 new ones that cropped up. And I spent all my time getting ready to solve this one, and so then I have to go back through this whole cycle again, and I'm never really getting anywhere. And so if that's where we're at, it's not surprising that those were the emotions that we saw from our friend Amy, who was the buyer, right? That she felt like she had to make this huge case, that she would need to justify it, that it would take time, that you might have to make all these trade-offs in terms of quality and quantity and all these other things. Because in a world like this, you just don't have that chance to actually, have that input and move more quickly. And like I said, some people would say, who cares, right? We picked the right problem, we worked on the most important thing, and now we're here. And I guess I just believe, that that's a false dichotomy. Like, I don't want to have to feel like I need to just pick one. Yes, we have to prioritize. Yes, there's different resource constraints, but it just felt like the line at which we're doing that was just so great that we weren't able to do what we want. And so there's a number of things that I would call out here. So one is this idea of those orphan business problems, right? It's something I started calling them, is that there's all these problems out there, and they just get abandoned. And we might think they're small, we might think that they're not important, but if you add them all up, right, even if some of them are unimportant, there's value there. And so as a steward of Target Corporation and of what we're trying to do, it didn't feel right that we were constantly leaving all these bits of value on the table. Almost more importantly though, some of this comes back to Amy the buyer. What are we doing if we're constantly telling people no? We're constantly telling them that you can't ask that question about your data because it's not the most important thing. It's only number 11, it's not 1 to 10. And why should we be surprised if people aren't exploring data or aren't using our tools or doing it on their own or just doing it on gut, which is sort of the scary thing for a data guy, because we've taught them this. We've taught them that it takes such extraordinary effort to meet their business problem and to solve it, that there's no reason and no hope for them to do it. And one of the analogies I use a lot in this space is this idea of sort of a medical analogy, right? So if you have a cold and you show up and you go to the Mayo Clinic, which is in Minnesota where I'm from, right? And you're talking to oncologists and all these specialists, and you show up there and you say, I have a cold, they're gonna say, you know what, I'm curing cancer. I have all these degrees, I have all this fancy equipment. I'm sure you can imagine data scientists maybe saying the same thing. And so I can't help you. You're sick, I'm sorry, but I don't do colds. And if you looked at that objectively, it would make sense. We shouldn't, they're curing cancer, that's super important, that's number 1 on our list, but they still have a cold. And so how do you find ways to have the urgent care or the triage clinic to help people with those things? And how do you build systems that let you help people with colds even while you have some people that are trying to cure cancer? And so that's part of that risk, I think, of orphaning all these business problems, is that you still have people with cold, and if everyone in your business ecosystem has a business cold, then you're going to be in trouble. The third thing is this fallacy of self-service, right? So I see this a lot, and it's sort of related to end-to-end of, I'm going to build something, and it's going to be fully self-service, and I'm going to be done, and that's it, right? I build it, and I do it. And I used to tell my team, and there's varying levels of appropriate versions of this phrase, but I'd say, there's a fine line between self-service analytics and piss off. You could insert other more inappropriate versions of that too, but right, just because something is self-service doesn't mean someone doesn't deserve some help, some guidance, some tweaking, some back and forth conversation. And so if we build things thinking we're gonna build it, it's gonna be done, and they're gonna go use it, and everyone's gonna use data, we're sort of kidding ourselves. That's not the reality of where most organizations are, and we shouldn't think that self-service means a lack of empathy and a lack of sort of driving that information with people. And then the last thing, and some of this is a variation on Agile and other pieces, is we know nothing is ever complete. We know in business things are going to constantly change, and both our priorities, the business environment, Amazon, whatever it is going to come in and make changes. And so how are we going to react? And if we're constantly just focusing on these few most important things and not building an ecosystem that allows for this last mile of insight delivery and this end to almost end approach, then we're never going to be able to react to that, because we're always going to have to wait that long 9-month or 12-month or 6-month cycle, and we might pick the wrong one. And then in that 6 months, again, something happens, a competitive threat or a change in the economy, whatever it is. And so if we're not thinking about these things, if we're satisfied with that long cycle and that prioritization, you're never going to really be competitive, at least in my opinion. So what have people done, right? So we know that's not the full solution. And so one thing I've seen, which in all fairness, Domo is partly this solution as well, is this idea of it's not end-to-end, it's end-to-engineer, right? So if I think about things like APIs, code templates, containers, Kubernetes, different componentized architecture, really are sort of this idea of building a platform, right, by nature. A lot of times I find at Target, when I talk to engineers in IT, this is what they would talk about. They'd say, yes, we're going to build platforms. My struggle is, and the idea is the same. It's like I can build a platform, lots of people can use it, but it still requires engineering knowledge to make it work, right? And I don't know if any company has unlimited engineers, maybe Google, but I just didn't have enough engineers to solve every business problem to be able to do this. So if I'm purely relying on people who know how to fully code or write API or JSON or whatever it is, then I'm still going to be back in that same dilemma. It's going to be a little bit better. And again, Domo is this way too. We have open architecture and all those things, but I still need an engineer for every problem. And so the other extreme, which I think everyone in this room is probably very familiar with, is what I call, it's not end-to-end, it's end-only. Right? So this is Excel, this is Access, this is emails, this is Google Sheets, this is, you know what, I'm just going to find the place where I know I don't have any of these constraints, where I can sort of go curious to my heart's content, but there's many risks that come with this, right? It's complete flexibility, right? And I'm saying, hey, let everyone innovate, that's great, but what happens when you're trying to be consistent, when you're trying to govern, when you're trying to scale, when there's no automation or that person goes on vacation or whatever it is, you sort of lose some of that. And those are the things that always, engineering is always going to point straight to those. And the business is always going to point straight to the flexibility. And so we need to find something that's sort of in the middle. And so that's when I think about how we use Domo at Target, and again, what I think the secret sauce to unlocking the data or starting the journey to unlocking the data is this idea of end to almost end, right? So I'm going to build it almost to the end. I'm going to build it in a way that is very intentionally not fully complete. And there's a lot of struggles to this, right? I think, and back to emotions, right? The emotions run through all of it. It is valid for an engineer to come back and say, wait, you don't want me to talk to the business? I was working on this business problem and I talked to them and it was awesome, and I spent 9 months working on a real problem and not engineering things. And that's just, the reality is we can't afford them as a valuable resource to do all that. It doesn't mean that it's not the inspiration. And so what we're able to do if we do that is that last mile of insight delivery can happen very close to the business problem, right? So the analysts supporting Amy in the home area of Target, which includes that storage and organization bins, they can go and they can take a foundation that is still well engineered in other pieces and meet Amy on that last mile of what she needs to manage that week after Christmas, right? And sometimes that might be, we can talk later in questions for sure, about centralized BI, not centralized BI, all those different pieces. Sometimes that might be a analytics professional or someone in the 1%, or it might be someone in the business who was like the 1% plus who actually cared about data and wanted to learn and explore. But the point being that it still is happening very close to the business and reacting very close to the business too in terms of how you do that. I think one caution, and back to the emotions that I've seen here too, is it's hard for people to make this switch, right? If you have all that emotional baggage, you don't learn to ask questions, right? You've been taught, don't ask questions unless you have VP approval and a business case and all these other things. So if I have a system that's more flexible and more end to almost end, what can end up happening is I put it out there and people don't ask questions back, and that also doesn't work, right? Because part of the power of the flexibility is in the conversation, right? And so we certainly had cases at Target where I would find people would do the old sort of routines, whether it's through a business case or they'd complain to their boss and the boss would complain to the boss and they'd come back down and would come around. And really, if they had just talked to my team, it would be 5 minutes to change it. Or we can answer 90% of what they wanted in 5 minutes, right? So part of that emotional journey for the business and from changing it isn't just about how to use data. It's about changing the relationship with the people helping them with the data. And sort of showing them how that works. One thing that I found really useful that we did in Domo, it's just sort of a tip and trick, is one of the first dashboards we built, we brought in some users from 8 to 10 in the morning and had them play around with the dashboard, gave us a bunch of feedback. So here's a list of 25 things you want to change, sent them away, brought them back at 4 p.m., and showed them the changes. So we got to 11 of your 25. And it was this eye-opening moment because they grew up with all that emotional baggage. They needed to actually physically see the change in the flexibility of an end-to-almost-end platform because they weren't going to believe you because they've been told a million times, oh, this is going to be the best thing ever, and it never worked out. As I sort of mentioned in terms of this idea of like, am I now away from the business problem? The inspiration is always solving business problems. Like this whole ecosystem, the whole idea is how do I create a platform that lets me solve more business problems? It's just that I'm no longer constructing it in the same way. I'm letting that be the inspiration, but I'm doing it in a way that's going to meet the next problem and the next problem and the next problem, right? And so, a platform that could scale and give information. So, there's an example with that buyer, but similar things where we have, on Valentine's Day, we sell lots of flowers. So the flower buyer does need to know in real time, every 5 minutes we're loading data, how many flowers did I sell at a store? Am I running out of flowers? Should I make a change? How am I doing? This is my biggest day of the year. The CEO doesn't need to see that, but it's actually the same data set that's driving both and that was designed in a way that lets me be more flexible. The last thing here, and then we could open up to questions soon, is this doesn't mean that, one, it doesn't mean I hate engineers, right? I love engineers, I just don't have enough of them. Same thing with data scientists, right? It's like if I had enough to have dedicated engineers and data scientists and a full agile team and the whole deal for every business problem I had, that could be awesome too, but probably not a good return on investment in terms of cost. This doesn't mean you're not maintaining engineering rigor, right? And what I mean by that is, I might not be an engineer, but I can schedule things. I can have code integrated back into GitHub. I can have monitoring of errors and usage and all those kinds of things. And so I can bring some of that rigor to how a non-engineer is working, which then lets me feel a little bit better about that. And certainly, I feel like there were a few times when people said they had challenges with IT or whatever that piece is. The challenges sometimes can be frustrating, but most of the time it's legitimate, right? We legitimately need visibility to when things fail. We legitimately need a log of what's going on. So when I'm talking about end to almost end, it's not the end to almost end with no engineering rigor. It's how do I infuse more and more engineering rigor into how I'm working with my team and how I'm doing things every day. So end of the day, and we have a good chunk of time here for questions, it really just for me is about this idea that if I'm going to empower people, I need to trust them. I need to give them a platform that they can use and that lets them take that last mile of insight delivery. Because at Target, it was not about me knowing every little thing that everyone was doing. It was about let's create an ecosystem, a community, a support ecosystem that lets people build content and then go after that business value together. So I didn't necessarily always know what was going on in every little pocket, right? And that's part of it. I could have visibility, and there might be times I need to lock it down, but it really just let me change sort of the culture of what we were doing and how people were encouraged to do that. And one of the things I say is as a leader, I have choice. I have limited time. I have limited, mental capacity and strategic capacity. And I would much rather my job as a leader be how do I align and make sure we're not making mistakes with pockets of innovation than starting from the premises, I'm going to use all my energy and my focus to really govern and push out some innovation because I'm scared of what it's going to happen. And they're both hard. They both require energy. But I just, both personally and I think philosophically as a business leader, believe we need to find ways to let that innovation happen and then, still govern and make sure it's not going out of certain bounds. But that's sort of some of my journey at Target. And I obviously could tell you a million stories and talk on, but I'll open it up for questions and we can see where that goes.
Hey, can you hear me? I'm not really good with mics generally. So I'm Timur. I'm the ops manager at The Yield. We're a small business, 30 people business. And so my question is sort of relevant, making things relevant to my business. The challenge we have is, you've been speaking about bigger businesses where there's engineering teams or data scientists available, but the end user cannot get what they need because the data scientist is working on something more important. I have a very different challenge. My challenge is that we don't have a data scientist, but the business still has questions. So to keep it short, but you can ask me more questions for context. But how does Domo or what is the solution out there for a situation where people have questions, but you don't have the resources to even start from the scratch? But you need something to get the ball rolling, to give some sort of visibility in a small business for function owners to know what's going on and to make data-driven decisions.
No, really fair. And I guess it's a really good point too, and a reminder for me, especially as I get out of my Target mindset into right. There's lots of different size companies and how we work in that. It could be anywhere from they're working on the most important things to I just don't have them and how do I do that? So I guess what I really like about Domo, and I mentioned this before too about just the toolkit, is it lets me start dipping my toe into some of those things, whether it's with outlier detection and just some of those basic, and I'm sure it's not really data science, it's just sort of starting dipping into analytics so that even if I don't have that full engineering staff or data scientist team or whatever you want to say, I can start using that in my business. So with smart alerts or with using the annotation that Chris showed before to be able so that people can visually start seeing what's when changes got made and what happened to metrics and those kinds of things. And then again, you can start using some basic regression and other pieces within Domo as well in terms of ETL because again, you're probably not going to have the time to go and fully learn R, let's say, right away. But if you can, within the ecosystem, leverage the data, leverage some of the things that Catherine and team, and she'll show in the sneak peek in a little bit too, are working on, it lets you start inching towards that. And I guess I'm also a big believer that, data science is great and it has its place, and obviously it's a trendy term, but ultimately, the starting point of thinking about data isn't always complicated. It's exception reporting, it's getting the data in one place, it's looking at trends, it's looking at outliers, and those are some things that I think you start priming the pump, and then as those maybe become more automated in your ecosystem, you could start nudging into it. But I think some of the stuff out of the box in Domo lets you start that journey and maybe, and then also make it a place and a platform that maybe at a company of 30 you hire one data scientist, right? Whose work can actually have a lot more benefit because you have a platform that makes it easy for people to use and redo it. Good question though, good reminder. Anyone else? Tea time?
There we go.
Okay.
Hi, I'd just ask one quick question.
Yeah.
My name's Katie Menya. I work for Southern Cross Austereo in data and analytics. I'm just wondering, we have staff that is absolutely data terrified. Do you have any suggestions for getting them started on the journey?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of it is to keep it simple, right? And again, none of this is rocket science, so keep it simple. Think about benchmarking and relativity, right? Like, so how do I know what is good? How do I know what I could maybe do with this information? Depending, like, how do I know what's relevant? And there's certainly many features in Domo in terms of personalization and PDP and other things where it's a lot of times if you show someone a lot of data and only, right, whatever, it's 100 rows, just as an example, if only 10 of the rows are relevant to them, they're going to be too scared to sift through and figure that out. So how can I find ways to show what's relevant and curate the content? I think it's one of the things I often talk about, like there's security, but then there's content curation, and we did a lot of that at Target in terms of it's not that this person isn't allowed to see all this data, but what's most relevant. They're responsible for these 3 classes, so by default, let's just show them those 3 classes so that they can see what's most relevant and sort of bubbling that up for them versus making them boil the ocean and do those things. I mean, look, I also think peer pressure is great. Right? Like once one person comes to a meeting with the boss and has better information or can say, hey, I was able to get ahead of these 2 problems because I saw this, this, and this. And obviously peer pressure works across. It also works from the top. I mean, so I think at Target, we were very fortunate to have leaders who were using Domo, who were talking to their direct reports and their direct reports about data, or if someone saw them on Domo, it sends a message. If your VP is using it, then it's something I probably need to figure out. And so you don't want to make it, feel bad, but I think that's part of that is like at the leadership level, if that's something they're committed to, which hopefully they are, they also need to walk the walk a little bit because otherwise people see through that, right? If it's, hey, you really have to be using data, but you don't see any of the leaders using data, or they still require a PDF or whatever it is, then it just is not authentic, and then people will just go away, I think. Good question. Anything else? We have a few minutes. If not, I think we have tea outside. Is that right? Or is that
We've got about 5 minutes if anyone's got another question.
It's after lunch. It's tough
Yeah.
after lunch.
It's getting a bit quiet. Perhaps, Ben, you can maybe share some of the real-time insights that the execs were getting at Target.
Yeah.
And what sort of insights they were getting, and I guess how often as well.
Yeah, I mean, so actually I'll share an interesting one. I was just talking about the other day with Brent is a couple things. So one is, like, again, back to this emotion thing. There's also emotion in like either making or not making a goal, right? So as much as it sort of seems silly when you say it, but so like for the CEO at Target, he knew the day before, because we had real-time reporting, okay, roughly how are we doing, right? And so then when he got an email in the morning alert saying like, how did the day end? It wasn't this big emotional event. And that has real consequences, right? When you have that big emotional event, sometimes there's real need to go after it, but sometimes it's just more emotion. So whether it's getting the data more earlier, or rather than looking at something weekly, if you sort of look at it over the course of time, I think that helps. So there's that emotional piece, and then there's just also just making sure we're on the right page. So like over the holiday season this last year at Target, we had daily stand-ups with the chief merchandising officer and a lot of other senior officers, and we had a Domo email that went out at 6 a.m., and everyone knew what happened, and we didn't spend the time in the meeting, everyone regurgitating, my business area did ABC. It was, everyone knows what happens, everyone saw the email. Mark, the chief merchandising officer, could say, these are the 2 things we need to talk about. Do we need to change this marketing for next week because this is slow? I mean, you can really get into the meat of it because you lose sort of that aspect where it's, where you're sort of going back and forth and arguing about which data is right, or even just you start getting rid of that need to just constantly regurgitate data. I think people feel that because they want to have a voice. Everyone wants to say something. Well, if your business is doing fine and there's nothing has to happen, or if you manage the essentials and beauty business over holiday, we probably don't have to talk about toilet paper at the key meeting, right? That's not the most important thing. Do we call it toilet paper in Australia? Okay, good. You never know what people call things. I'm very sensitized now that I've been so such a bad Aussie. But I think knowing what you need to talk about can really change the dynamic of how things are working and how they operate in that context. I'm trying to think of a couple other examples of things that were up. Question. Go ahead. Hold on, that'll be easier at the mic.
Sorry, yeah, just saying, if you're building an analytics solution for a team of non-analysts, what's the key design decision that you're making that makes it an end to almost end rather than end to end? Is it the interactivity or is it something else?
No, it's a good question, and there's probably some gray area there. I think for me, part of it is sort of scale, right? So building at a scale with knowing that you could have multiple potential outcomes in mind, right? Like versus saying I am building like when I started, right? Like I'm building promo data for digital, and that's all I'm focusing on, and that's all the data is going to solve. I think there's also just an inherent flexibility, right? So, and some of that, again, not that I hate engineers, but when I have a limited number of engineers, it has to be that a non-engineer can make a change, right? If I feel like adding one column to a chart or to a table or to a data set requires an architect or an engineer, and there's only two of them, and I have to wait 6 months, then to me, that's where you start losing that flexibility. So I think flexibility might be the number one thing I would look at is if you look at yourself and you look at your solution, you say, how easily can I change if something was different? Or if another problem came up that I didn't know about, then that would sort of be one of my key delineators. Uh-oh.
What were the success metrics that you set for yourself on the journey, or how have you seen others define success on their journey, and what would you share with the audience here?
No, that's a good question. I think it's a hard one because ultimately, like the holy grail is exactly what business decision was impacted by this visualization, and was it a good one, and what were the results? And there's more and more happening with technology that lets us connect more of that. I think for us, one of the proxies we had to use was usage, right? So one of the things I push my team at is we need to run our data like a website, right? So if people come in and they are clicking, are they repeating, are they, which content is getting used and not getting used, and that's, albeit a very rudimentary proxy and not a analytic proxy for the actual business decision. I think there were some cases where we could start actually linking it to business value, which I think is the best practice where you can, right? So if I was able to stop a bad pricing decision early because we caught it, and it would have taken us 2 days or 1 day in a former situation, then you can actually calculate the value that you brought to the company. So I think it has to be sort of a nuance, starting with, I think engagement is a good first one, and it's something that we provide within Domo through Domo Stats now. But then I would constantly work, and still am working at Domo too, of how do you actually attach it to the actual business value, because that's going to be the ultimate. I think one of the things I struggle with a lot with this end-to-end, almost end framework is you're a little bit saying like, well, I want to prepare for what I don't know about. So it's hard to really measure and value what I don't know about, especially if I'm making a business case for an investment and all these other things. And so you need some hard metrics to know what's going on. And know how you're sort of shifting the business. I think also, whether it's NPS or just doing a survey, we did a lot of surveying of customers too, of like, are you able to get the data you want? And that's, again, it's not as perfect as attaching it directly to the business solution, but if we can start watching that emotional curve and maybe see some of these emotions change, we know we're at least moving the culture a little bit, and then over time can better connect it to business value.